Hey Dev Team, welcome back to Flutter with Drag. I'm doing another one in this set of series with our quiz app, only because I said to one of my commenters that I would add in a few extra features. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I will connect this app up to authentication so we can have users and have the ability to log high scores and then display the high scores for the users. I'm only going to do a basic implementation, but it'll give you an idea of where to take this depending on how you want your app to develop. Currently, I'm busy working on the next series, and I'm quite excited to bring you that one fairly soon. So, without further ado, we need to head over to console.firebase.google.com because I'm going to use Firebase as the backend for this app, and we need to set up a new project. So once you've signed up for an account with Firebase, which is fairly straightforward, you will end up with a page like this where we need to add a new project. So the project name, well, I'm just going to call it my quiz app, and I'll spell quiz right. Okay, so I've got a unique name for the project. I'm not too bothered about that. So we will continue. It asks us next if we want to use Google Analytics, and if I was doing a live app, we certainly would, but I'm going to turn this off now because I don't need to set that up for this project. I'm not putting analytics into this one, so let's create our project. This will take a few seconds. Okay, we have our new app ready and we can continue. So we have a brand new app, and we are going to be using a few things. Now, when you come to the app, you'll need to come to the build, because we're going to be using authentication, Firestore, and hosting for this particular app. So let's start off with authentication. I'm going to do all the setup now so I don't have to worry about it later on. So come into authentication and get started, and it's going to ask us what type of authentication are we going to use, and there's all sorts of things here. You can link up with Google, sign in, Apple sign in, GitHub, Facebook, all the rest of it. We're just going to use email and password for our app, so I'm going to click on that and click on enable to enable email and password and save. And that's all we need to do to set up our authentication. You can see we've got no users yet. Next, we're going to come to Firestore database and click on create database. And we're going to start this in test mode, which basically means all the documents within the database are going to be open for the world to read and write. It's not very secure, but it will do for now. We will come back and put some security into that later on. It's going to ask you where you're going to want to store your Firebase. You've got all sorts of data centers. Choose the one that's nearest to you. I'm going to go with Europe West. Okay, and that's set up our cloud Firestore for us. We'll look at that when we come to do that. And then finally, let's come to hosting and click get started on hosting. We need to install some tools, which I've already done. So click next. We need to initialize our project, which we'll do in a minute, and then we'll need to deploy it, which we will do in a minute. And that will give us a domain name which we can use later on for our app. You can also add a custom domain if you have a custom domain. Okay, that is our setup here in Firebase done. Let's switch back to our code. Right, so back in our VS Code, I'm just going to increase our terminal size here because we're going to be doing a bit of work here. So we need to install a few bits and bobs. The first one is the Firebase command line tools, and There's a bit to that depending on your operating system and what have you, and whether you've got Node installed. So I'm not going to go through that here, but there is plenty of documentation for that on the Firebase console website. You'll be able to get all that information and ensure you have Firebase tools set up. Essentially, you want to be able to enter Firebase and get a help message. As long as you're at that point, we're good to go. So within our app, and you may choose to do this somewhere else, but I'm going to do it within the app folder structure, so we've got everything in one place. We're going to call Firebase init and basically follow the prompts on the screen. You're about to initialize a Firebase project in this directory. Are you ready to proceed? Yes. So it asks us then, what do we want? Well, we're going to be having or using Firestore. We're going to be using hosting, and that's all that we need to do at this point here. So we'll select those two and hit enter. It'll ask you what account you're using. If you've only got one account, it'll just pop up. But I'm using this one, and we're going to use an existing project because we've already created the project on the Firestore platform. And so I'm going to select the project that we're using, and then it will ask us what file should be used for the Firestore rules. Well, we'll keep the default, and the default for the indexes. And then it will ask us what we want to use as our public directory, and it suggests public. Well, this is our public HTML directory, and we've already created one called server. So I'm just going to change that to server and hit enter. Do we want this to be set up as a single page app? No, we don't want that in this case. And do we want to set up automatic deploys with GitHub? No, we don't want to do that either. And do we want to overwrite our existing HTML? No. Okay, and that is everything set up. So now we can actually take what's in our server folder, which is 404 that Firebase has put in for us, 404 page, our initial index page that we wrote previously, which has got really nothing in it, the images for our categories, and our quiz JSON. And we can say Firebase deploy only hosting, because Firebase Deploy deploys a number of different things depending on what services you're using. Right now we're only worried with hosting. Let's hit that. Give it a few seconds. And now if we come over to our Firebase hosting and refresh, it tells us that we have a current deployment and when it was deployed. And if we click on this here to go to our website, we get our blank page, which is our blank home page. But if we put after that quiz.json, we now get our quiz.json being served from our website. So we can now use this URL within our code. We'll just copy that, and we can use that as our web server, and we don't have to then worry about our local going live and all the rest of it that we were doing before. Okay, so let's come back to our quiz and let's find the right document, which is repositories, quiz repository. And in here somewhere we have this URL that we've been using. Yep. And so we're just going to replace that now with that URL we've copied and pasted. And that's now coming off a live server. Okay, now we need to install a few plugins. And I'm going to do them all now at the same time, even though we're not going to use them all straight away. but it's easier to do that and then restart our app or rebuild our app with everything there. So Control-Shift-P, add update dependencies. So we're going to need Firebase core, which you need if you're putting any Firebase project in, Cloud Firestore for the database, Firebase Auth for our authentication, and then a non-Firebase related thing which I'm going to use later on, and we'll look at it after. It's called username_gen, username generator. So let's hit enter, get them installed, and just check our pubspec.yaml as soon as this has stopped running. And we should have, make sure they're all installed, Firebase Core, Firebase Auth, Cloud Firestore, and username gen. Okay, next on Android, because we're using Firebase and Firebase Auth, we need to come to our Android folder, to our app and our build Gradle, and come down to here, the default config, and change the min SDK version to 21. And save that. You can go lower, but then you have more configuration to do with things to do with multi-decks. Let's keep it simple. So we're going with 21 there. And then we need to also use another command line tool, which we can find the instructions for on the firebase.flutter.dev docs. We need the command line for that, and to install this we need to do dart pub global activate flutterfire _CLI. Now I've already done that, and what we're going to do is follow the installation now for Flutterfire, and that's just reminded me actually there's one other package we need, which is the Flutterfire UI, which I'm going to use. So we'll need to add that in a minute as well. But you need to come over to this Flutterfire docs overview, getting started overview, and you need to run a few commands, mainly this one, flutterfire.configure. So let's do that. Okay, let's expand the screen again. It'll ask us which platforms we're making it for. For now, I'm just making this for Android, but you can select whatever you want there. And it will, because we've initialized it already, Firebase within our app, it's got all the configuration it needs to set everything up for us. Okay, that's finished and that's now complete. And so finally, let's add this one package that I missed. So Control-Shift-P, add package, and it's flutterfire.ui. Next, you want to come to your Android build Gradle, and in the dependencies, you need to paste in this line, which you can copy from the installation documents. Save that, and then back to the build Gradle where we've just changed the number, and at the bottom of that file you need to paste in apply plugin com Google GMS Google Services. Save that. The final thing you need to do is come over to your project overview, project settings, and if you scroll down to your project, your Android app, you need to download this Google Services.json and put it into your Android app directory. Now, Flutter Fire does have an automatic way of configuring all this. It's a little bit hit and miss. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So I've gone with a combination of some of the automated parts and some of the manual parts. However, if you follow the instructions, follow it for the automatic install, and if you run into problems, just go along the manual installation. Some of the services provided by Firebase, you have to go along with the manual configuration, so sometimes it's better to do that route anyway. And that's it. Let's rebuild our app now and see if it works. The app is up and running, and it looks like all the packages we installed are okay. So we need to initialize Firestore before we can use it, or Firebase before we can use it, and we can do that quite quickly within our main.dart. First of all, we need to ensure that the widget Flutter bindings is initialized, or is initialized. So widget Flutter bindings dot ensure initialized, and then simply await Firebase, which will import dot initialize app options default Firebase options dot current platform. And that's it. Another quick hard restart of that. Hot restart, and we're good to go. So that is the installation of that all done, and Firebase is ready to go. So let's start with our Auth Authentication. Now, the way I want this app to work is I don't want to require users to authenticate when they start using the app. Some apps you do, some apps, you might display a couple of sort of welcome screens and some splash screens, and then force the users to register for your app. I want this app to be free to use in terms of registration. So it's an option. They can use it as a guest. However, if they use it as a guest, some features will be limited. So for example, if they're using it as a guest, their high score won't be saved, and they won't be able to view other people's high scores. That is only going to be available to people who register. That's the way I've chosen for this app to work. How you do it is entirely up to you. So with that in mind, let's come over to our models, and I'm going to create a new file which I'm going to call app user model.dart. And this is going to be a class app user, and I'm going to store just a few bits of information about the user. First of all, I want to store a unique ID which we will be getting from Firebase Auth. I want to have a display name of the user, and I'm going to have a Boolean which tells me if this user is a guest or not. And that's all I want for this particular app. I'm going to generate the constructor for that. It's all required. And I'm also going to create a factory for the app user, which is going to be called empty, so I can generate an empty user, or essentially an unauthenticated user. So that's going to return an app user with a blank user ID, a blank display name, and isGuest is going to be true. And that's it for our model. Okay, the next thing I want is an Auth Block for the whole app. Let's just shrink some of this down so we can see what we're doing. Okay, so in our lib folder, I'm going to right click on that block, new block, and I'm simply going to call this auth. And that will create my auth block for me. So let's start with the auth state. And we've got an auth initial, and I'll leave it as that. And we're going to have an auth block, which I'm going to call ready. I'm not going to call it authorized because they may not be authorized. They may be a guest user, but it means that we know what state they're in and we have something. So that's going to extend auth state, and it's going to have a final app user. We need to import that. So I just realized in my models, I just need to export our app user model in our barrel file, and so then we'll import the app user, generate a constructor. That's going to be a const, and we're going to override the props. Okay, so that is our state taken care of. In terms of our events for our auth block, we're going to have an event called app started, which extends auth event, and that's going to take no properties. And we're going to have an event called app user changed, which is going to extend auth event. This is going to take an app user, the final app user, again we need a constructor for it, generate a constructor, it's going to be a const, and override the props. Excellent. Finally, we can come to our block and put in our code here. So our first event was app started, and I'm going to extract that onto on app started, and we're going to create that method. And the other event we had was app user changed. I'm going to call that on app user changed. In fact, let's just call it on user changed, and extract that method, or create it, sorry. Right. We'll do that one first. That's the easiest, simplest one. All we're going to do on a user change is emit auth ready and pass in the user, which we get from the event, and that takes care of that method. Now the on app started is going to be a little bit more interesting, because what we need to do is set this block up to listen for changes in the Firebase authentication, and there is a stream that Firebase Auth provides to us, which allows us to monitor authorization state changes and do something when that state changes. So we're going to have to set up a stream subscription and watch that stream. So let's create a reference for that stream subscription first of all. A stream subscription. Type app user, but it may be null. We're just going to call this auth state changes. Now, if there's a stream, we want to make sure that we close it. So within our auth block, we need to override the close method, which is a future void called close. It's got to return, return super.close. And we can also here check our auth state changes, and if it exists, we're going to cancel it. Okay, so we don't have streams lying around. If this auth block disappears, it's going to call the close, and if auth state changes is active, if it's not null, it will cancel it. Okay, so let's set that up here. So what do we want that to equal? Auth state changes is going to equal Firebase auth instance auth state changes. So that's listening to Firebase auth and is going to return a user, Firebase user, when that changes. But we want to convert that Firebase user into our app user. So we're going to run this through a map where we're going to get a Firebase user, and then we can say Firebase user, if it's all unauthenticated, we will get a null here. So what we can say is if Firebase user equals null, and we're going to return an app user empty. That's the thing we set up previously, and that will make sure that guest is set to true. However, if there is a Firebase user, then we need to turn that into a user. So let's do this here. Final user equals app user. And we've got a few things we want to do. Well, isGuest is going to be false because this is a valid user. The UID we're going to get from the Firebase user UID. And the display name we're going to get from, well, this is the problem. We could get it from Firebase user.displayname. However, that could be null. However, what we're going to do is we'll come back and fix that in a second. Let's just return our user. And then we want to listen to that, where we get a user. So from all of this, we're getting a user out, either an app user empty or an app user. We're listening to that, and when that happens, we're going to add an event, app user changed, and then we're going to pass in that user. Okay, so we've got this error still because this could be null. So how do we deal with that? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a string, an optional string called display name, and that is going to equal Firebase user display name. Then we're going to say if the display name is null or display name is empty, i.e. if there's been no display name set up, we're going to make display name equal the username gen. This is where that generator comes in, generate, and that will generate a random username for us. You can read the docs of username gen. It is customizable a bit, but essentially it will create a random username. Then we want to update Firebase because next time the user logs in, it might not get the same, the username generator will be random again. So what we need to do is make sure the Firebase user has a display name set. So we're going to take the Firebase user and update the display name with the new display name. And then in here, instead of using Firebase user display name, we'll just use display name. So let's go through that. On authentication change, we get the Firebase user. If the Firebase user is null, we just create an empty apt user, which is essentially a guest. We then get the display name. If the display name already exists, then that's fine. We just jump down here and do that. If the display name is null or doesn't exist or is blank, we generate a new display name and save that back to Firebase Auth, and then use that new name, and then we convert this, or we listen to those user changes, and whenever that happens, we call app user change, the event, and when we call the event, that uses the onUserChange method, which emits the state auth ready with that user. So by the time this happens, we've either got an empty guest user here or an authenticated user. Let's save that. Okay, so where do we want to call all that from? Where do we want that processing to begin? Well, I'm going to do it on the main, and I'm going to do it just outside our material app, because the whole thing can be authenticated. So I'm going to put in a block provider there, which is going to provide the Auth Block. Just need to do those imports. And at that point, we're going to add our app started event. So the authentication happens immediately. Let's save that and do a hot restart of the app. And we shouldn't really see any changes because we're not doing anything. You'll find more happening probably in the actually you won't. I was going to say you'll find more happening in the debug console, but blocks by default are lazy. So actually this hasn't been called yet because we're not using the auth block anywhere. As soon as we try and access the auth block, then it'll all happen. This will all happen. You can override that by setting in the block provider. You could set lazy to false, and it would load that up at this point. But we don't need to do that. I'm just going to leave it. Okay. Let's come to our home page, and I'm going to just put a little thing in here which is going to check whether we've got a user or not, and if we have got a user logged in, it's going to display that user. Otherwise, it's going to suggest that they sign up. So in our home page, where we have our column, before we display our categories, I'm going to add in a new thing which I'm going to call it auth prompt. Now that doesn't exist yet. I'm going to create that, and I'm going to create it in my widgets folder because I'm going to use this in a couple of places. So in the app widgets, the main widgets folder, create a new file called auth prompt. Oops, auth prompt.dart. And we'll create the stateless widget auth prompt. That's going to be material, and within our widgets we need to, our barrel file, export that. Back to our home page and import our widgets barrel file, and we have our auth prompt. Doesn't make any changes yet because we haven't got anything coming out of it. So let's go to that file, and what we're going to do here is essentially return something based on the auth state. So we need to put in our block builder for our auth block. and import everything that we need to import there. So what we can do now, we can say if state is auth ready, i.e. if we have a user, we then need to check whether we have a guest user or a non-guest user. So we're going to say if state app user is guest, then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to return a container, and we're going to have in that container a child of a column, and that's going to have some children. What do we want in here? Well, we'll just have some text for now, which says you are using this app as a guest. Your results will not be saved. And I think that's okay. Now, that should be the state we're in. So let's take a look at that. And yep, we've got that text showing up. Okay, let's do a little bit of decoration here as we go along. So let's put some margin on that, and we'll just put a 10 margin. 10, yep. Do we want padding in there? Don't think we need any padding. Maybe. No, I think that. Yes, let's put a decoration on it. Let's put a background color, and then we might need some padding. So I'm going to put a box decoration, and I'm going to put a color on it of sort of yellowy. Oh, amber might be good actually. Amber. Let's see, what's that look like? I want it to stand out. I want people to notice that they're not a guest. Right, yeah, we're going to need some padding in there then. So let's put in a under the margin padding const edge insets symmetric horizontal 15. Yep, okay, and vertical 5. Yeah, that'll do. And then, of course, we'll put our box decoration on because that's what we've been putting everywhere. Border, sorry. So border radius is going to be border radius circular, and we'll put 10 on, which is what we've been using pretty much throughout the app. So there we are. You're using this app as a guest. Your results will not be saved. We need them to be able to sign in. So let's put an elevated button. On pressed, we'll do something, and text will be sign in. Okay, that's a bit big and it's a bit ugly, but you can decorate that however you like. So moving on, what we need to do now is create a sign-in page. So under pages, I'm going to create a new folder called Auth, and I'm going to create a new file called sign in page.dart. This is going to be a stateless widget. Sign, and I'm going to call it app sign in page. Now the reason I'm calling this app sign in page rather than just sign in page is because initially what I'm going to return is a sign in screen from the Flutter UI, and we're going to configure this in a minute, but I'll just leave it as that for a second. Let's come back to our widget that we were just working on, and in the elevated button on pressed, we're going to put navigator dot push, and we're going to push a material page route, and the builder, don't really need the context, is going to be the app sign in page. Let's just put some commas in here so it formats it onto multiple lines, and you can see that. Let's click our sign in button and we have a sign in page. Fantastic. So we need somewhere now to type in a email address and a password to sign in or register. We already have the ability to switch between register and signing in. That's all provided for us in this Flutter UI. So if we come back to our code and in our provider configs, we simply need to put in email provider configuration and save that. And Bob's your uncle, we are good to go. So I haven't got an account, so let's register. My email, drag at test.com. Password is going to be password 123, and confirm password, password 123, and that has created us a user, hopefully. Now if we come across back to our Firebase console and hit refresh, we can see that we have our test user set up. But what didn't happen was when we signed up or registered, we didn't flip back to the previous page. We're still stuck on this register page. We need to do something about that. So for now, let's just put the push the back button on our phone. Come to our dev page, and I'm going to add a sign out button here so we can easily get out. So we do that in our home page, and under our elevated button, again Flutter or Flutterfy UI provides us with a sign out button. We just have to put it in, quick save, and we have a sign out button which will sign us out. And we've got our message back so we can sign in again. Okay, so let's figure out how to do that from our sign in page. Well, it's fairly straightforward. We're going to do two things here. Actually, there's two things I want to do. First of all, because sign in for us is optional, I want to put a back button on this page. So I'm going to wrap our sign in screen with a scaffold, which will take a body rather than a child. And we're just going to put an app bar in, just without anything in it, and that will give us a back button, which will be great there. And then I'm going to wrap the whole thing in a block listener, and a block listener will listen to a block. Let's just import all these bits and bobs, but it doesn't react to the state as such. It allows us to do something that doesn't require rebuilding of the page, and what we want to do here is navigate away from the page. Now we've got an error here, and the error is that auth state is defined in Flutterfire already. They've got auth state and we've got an auth state. So what I'm going to do is in our Flutterfire UI, we don't need theirs here, so I'm just going to hide auth state, which means this is our auth state from our block, auth block. And here we're going to say if state is auth ready and state.appUser is guest, or at least if it's not a guest. So if the state is auth ready and the user isn't a guest user, then we were going to navigate pop, which will mean we pop off that page. So I'll save that and restart that. Okay, so if we come to our sign-in page now and we sign in, so drive at test.com and password 123, and we hit enter, it pops us back to that previous page. We can't accidentally get to it, and our message telling us we're a guest has gone. But I want something there. I want some sort of indication that we've logged in. So let's come back to our widget auth prompt, and we've got the is guest. Well, now we're going to do if they're not a guest, or if they're registered a user. And here we're going to instead return a column. That's going to have some children, and we're going to have text, welcome back. And on the next line, we're going to have the state.appUser display name. And now this is when we save this, we're going to see for the first time what the random name that has been given to us is. So let's save that. Okay, I missed a semicolon. And we're adopted blockage 51. Fantastic. Okay, well, it's a name. So I'm going to wrap our column in, I was going to say wrap it in padding, but you know, I think what I'm going to do in the column, I'm just going to put a sized box of a height 10, and that will do. So if we're logged in, we see welcome back and our name, and if we're not logged in, we've got a message telling us that we should log in. We also I also want that same message to appear here if we're not logged in, because I want to, just before they start the quiz, I want a warning to say, you know, you're not logged in, your results are not going to get saved. So to do that, let's come back to our quiz intro page. So it's our quiz page, widgets, quiz intro. And under the description, I'm going to add an auth prompt box and save that. And there we are, we've got welcome back. But I don't want that message there. I only want the message if we're not logged in. So coming back to our auth prompt, I'm going to put into here final, what should we call this? Hide name. And that's going to be a bool, of course. And we're not going to set it as required. We're going to set it by default to be true. Yeah. And then down here where we've got our column, we're going to say hide name. If that is true, then I'm just going to show size box. Otherwise, we'll show the wording. So if we save that, come back to our emulator, our name has now disappeared from our home page. So we'll come to our home page, auth prompt, and put in hide name false. So there we are, we've got our name, and then when we go into our quiz, we haven't got anything. However, if we come to our dev and sign out, we have our warning here, and if we go to our quiz, we've got our warning there as well. So either way, the user is well and truly warned that they need to sign in if they want their results to be saved. And how we go about saving those results, we'll look at in the next episode. So folks, if you've enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, it does help me out. And we'll see you next time when we will finish this app. I'm not taking it any further than the basics, but we will get the high score table put in. Until then, folks, take care. We'll see you soon. Bye now.